The crack of the leather whip wasn't supposed to be part of the evening's entertainment at Aurelia. In a dining room where a single bottle of wine cost more than a month's rent and secrets were traded in hushed tones over truffle risotto, the sound was a violation, a sonic tear in the fabric of obscene wealth. 50 times the lash sliced through the air, each strike punctuated by a soft, choked gasp. In the center of the room, a young waitress crumpled to the priceless Persian rug, her simple black uniform in tatters. And the billionaire who wielded the whip, his face a mask of cold fury, had no idea that the girl bleeding on his floor was the only child of the one man in Washington, D.C. he should never have crossed. His world was about to be dismantled, piece by piece, not by an army or a market crash, but by the quiet, methodical rage of a father who held the nation's secrets. Clara Vance believed in the quiet dignity of work. It was a principle she clung to like a life raft in the turbulent waters of her own life. At 20, she should have been worrying about final exams and spring break plans, not whether her tips would cover the electric bill. But she had made a choice 2 years ago, to step away from the gilded cage of her father's world, a world of motorcades, embassy dinners, and the stifling pressure of being the daughter of Thomas Vance, the United States Secretary of State. She wanted to be just Clara, an art history major at Georgetown with a passion for the late Roman Empire and a talent for balancing 3 plates on one arm. Working at Aurelia was a paradox. It was the most exclusive restaurant in D.C., a place her father might entertain a foreign diplomat. Yet for Clara, serving its clientele was an act of rebellion, a way to move through their world unseen, a ghost in a black apron. She learned more about the city's power brokers by refilling their water glasses than she ever had at state dinners. She saw the cracks in their perfect facades, the desperation behind their confident smiles, the casual cruelty they reserved for those they considered beneath them. Tonight's private booking was for Alistair Finch. Clara knew the name. Finch was a tech mogul turned venture capitalist who had pivoted again into the world of private antiquities dealing. He was infamous for his temper and his collection, both of which were legendary. He had reserved Aurelia's entire Diocletian room, a private space walled with reclaimed Italian marble and centered around a single massive oak table. Clara's manager, a perpetually stressed man named Julian, had been clear. Mr. Finch is particular, he'd warned the staff. He is unveiling a new acquisition tonight for some investors. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact for too long. Do not exist, except to pour wine in clear plates. Clara nodded, her expression neutral. She'd dealt with men like Finch her whole life. They were a different species, men who saw the world not as a community of people, but as a collection of assets to be acquired and controlled. As the guests arrived, a coterie of slick, hungry-looking men in bespoke suits, Finch stood to greet them. He was a tall man in his late 40s with a lean, predatory build and eyes the color of a winter sky. He carried himself with an air of absolute ownership, as if he had purchased the very air in the room. In the center of the table, resting on a velvet cushion, was the reason for the gathering. It was a Roman Aquila, a legionary eagle standard, its bronze wings outstretched, its eyes seeming to glare with ancient authority. It was a breathtaking piece, a symbol of immense power. The eagle of the lost ninth, Finch announced, his voice smooth and commanding, recovered from a private collection in Geneva. The provenance is ironclad. As Finch launched into his speech, Clara moved silently around the room, refilling glasses. But her eyes kept drifting to the eagle. Something felt off. She had spent hundreds of hours studying artifacts from that period. The verdigris patina on the bronze seemed too uniform, too perfect. There was a detail on the carving of the talons, a slight stylistic flourish that reminded her more of a 19th century revival piece than a genuine first-century artifact. It was a tiny academic detail, the kind only a specialist would notice. She dismissed it as a trick of the low lighting. The dinner progressed, a symphony of clinking silverware and self-congratulatory murmurs. Clara worked with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and unobtrusive. The main course was served, a delicate seared duck with a cherry reduction sauce. As she leaned in to place a plate before one of the guests, a man to her right laughed loudly at one of Finch's jokes, throwing his arm back without looking. His elbow connected sharply with Clara's wrist. Time seemed to slow down. The platter tilted. The rich, dark sauce, a deep crimson lake, cascaded from the plate. It didn't land on the guest or the tablecloth. It splashed directly onto the stack of cream-colored parchment next to the Eagle Standard, the priceless, ironclad provenance papers. The room went dead silent. The laughter died in the man's throat. Every eye turned first to the spreading stain, then to Clara. Finch's face, which had been alight with triumphant bonhomie, froze. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief that slowly curdled into pure, unadulterated rage. He looked from the ruined documents to Clara, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You clumsy little fool," he hissed, the words low and venomous. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. I'm so sorry, sir. It was an accident." He bumped my arm. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Finch's voice rose, losing its smooth veneer and taking on a raw, guttural edge. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "Those documents were irreplaceable. They were the soul of that artifact." "Alistair, calm down," one of the guests murmured, looking uneasy. "It's just a spill." Finch didn't seem to hear him. He was fixated on Clara, who stood frozen, the empty platter still in her hands. "I pay for perfection. I demand it. And what I get is a half-wit girl who can't even carry a plate." He strode around the table. Julian, the manager, rushed forward. "Mr. Finch, please, we can handle this. The restaurant will cover any damages, of course." Finch shoved him aside without a glance. He stopped in front of Clara, towering over her. She could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "What is the price for incompetence?" he mused, his voice dangerously soft. "How does one teach a lesson that will be remembered?" His eyes darted to the side of the room, where a display case held other, smaller items from his collection. With a sudden, decisive movement, he walked to it, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and withdrew a long, thin object. It was a replica of a Roman flagrum, a short whip with multiple leather tails, a collector's curiosity, a brutal toy. A collective gasp went through the room. "Alistair, for God's sake, what are you doing?" another guest said, his voice strained. Finch ignored him. He walked back to Clara, the whip held loosely in his hand. "In ancient Rome," he said, his voice conversational, almost academic, "discipline was an art form. A lesson once taught was never forgotten." Clara's mind screamed, "Run!" but her feet were cemented to the floor. This wasn't happening. This was a nightmare. "Please," she whispered, her voice a thread. "Don't!" The first lash was almost surreal. It cracked through the opulent silence of the room, a sound as alien as a gunshot in a library. Pain, sharp and electric, exploded across her back. She cried out, stumbling forward, dropping the platter with a clatter that was lost in the ringing in her ears. The second strike followed immediately, then a third. The guests were statues of shock, their faces pale in the candlelight. No one moved. No one spoke. They were prisoners of Finch's madness, complicit in their silence. He was too powerful, too connected. To defy him was to invite professional ruin. Clara fell to her knees, her hands instinctively going to her stomach, though there was no child there to protect. It was a primal, desperate gesture of self-preservation. Tears streamed down her face, hot with pain, and a humiliation so profound it felt like it was dissolving her soul. "Count them," Finch snarled, his breath coming in ragged pants now. He was lost in his own power trip. "Every strike is a reminder of your worthlessness." The blows rained down. 10, 20. The thin fabric of her uniform offered no protection. Each impact felt like fire. Her world narrowed to the pattern on the rug, the taste of salt and blood in her mouth, and the rhythmic, sickening crack of leather. At 30, she saw Julian, the manager, pull out his phone, his hand trembling, only for one of Finch's associates to step forward and calmly take it from him with a menacing glare. At 40, the pain began to blur. A strange, detached numbness crept in at the edges of her consciousness. She was floating, watching this happen to someone else, a girl in a black uniform on the floor of a fancy restaurant. At 50, he stopped. The silence that descended was heavier, more suffocating than the noise had been. Finch's chest was heaving. He looked down at the whip, then at Clara's crumpled form, a flicker of something, perhaps satisfaction, perhaps disgust, in his eyes. He tossed the whip onto the table, where it landed with a soft thud next to the bronze eagle. He adjusted his cuffs, his composure returning with chilling speed. "Now," he said to the stunned room, his voice once again smooth and controlled. "Clean this up." He turned to his guests. "My apologies for the interruption, gentlemen. Let us proceed to the lounge for cognac. The demonstration of Roman discipline is, it appears, complete." As they filed out, averting their eyes from the girl on the floor, not a single one offered help. Finch paused at the door and looked back at Julian. "Fire her, and make sure she understands what happens when you speak of things that are not your concern. My legal team will be in touch about the damages." He was gone. Clara lay on the floor, each breath a new wave of agony. Humiliation was a physical weight pressing her down. Julian and another waiter cautiously approached. "Miss, are you all right? We need to call an ambulance." Clara pushed herself up, her body screaming in protest. The world spun. "No!" she gasped, the word tearing at her throat. "No hospital, no police. Just help me get home." She couldn't let this become a public spectacle. She couldn't bear the thought of her father finding out, of the pity, of the political storm it would create. She had wanted to be independent. Reporting this felt like the ultimate failure. Somehow, with Julian's help, she got into a taxi. As the car pulled away from the curb, she looked back at the glowing windows of Aurelia, a beacon of civilization that housed utter barbarism. In her pocket, her hand closed around her phone. Before the chaos, driven by that flicker of academic curiosity, she had taken 2 quick, discreet photos of the eagle and its stand. It was a meaningless gesture then. Now it felt like the only thing she had left. The secure conference room in the basement of the State Department was known as the Vault. It was soundproof, shielded from any form of electronic eavesdropping, and reserved for conversations that could alter the course of nations. Tonight, Secretary of State Thomas Vance was in the middle of one such conversation, negotiating a fragile ceasefire with the ambassador from a volatile nation, his words chosen with the precision of a surgeon. He was a man forged in the crucible of international diplomacy. Calm, analytical, and possessed of a formidable intellect, he was respected by allies and feared by adversaries. His public persona was one of unshakable control, but beneath the tailored suit and the steely gaze was a widower who had, by his own admission, failed in his most important role, that of a father. His wife's death 10 years ago had left a chasm between him and Clara, a distance he tried to bridge with tuition payments and awkward weekly phone calls, never quite finding the right words. Her fierce independence was both a source of pride and a constant, aching reminder of his own inadequacy. His chief of staff, a sharp, loyal woman named Evelyn Reed, entered the room and placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. Vance glanced down, annoyed at the interruption. The note was simple: Clara on line 2. Urgent. Vance's blood ran cold. Clara never called him at work, let alone on a secure line. He excused himself, his face an impassive mask, and stepped into his private office. He picked up the receiver. "Clara, what is it? Are you all right?" The voice on the other end was small, broken, and almost unrecognizable. "Dad," she whispered, and then she began to sob, a raw, painful sound that shattered his composure. "Clara, talk to me. Where are you?" Through her fractured breaths, the story came out. A spill, an angry customer, a whip. The name, Alistair Finch. Thomas Vance listened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. The diplomat, the negotiator, the Secretary of State all vanished. Only the father remained. A cold, silent fury began to build in his chest, an anger so profound it felt like a physical force. It was different from the calculated anger he used as a diplomatic tool. This was primal. "Stay where you are," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Don't talk to anyone. Don't do anything. I'm coming." He hung up, stood motionless for a second, and then walked back into the vault. He looked at the waiting ambassador and Evelyn. "Evelyn, postpone. National security matter." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which Evelyn knew was far more terrifying than any shout. The ambassador began to protest, but one look at the secretary's face silenced him. Within minutes, Vance was in the back of his armored Suburban, its lights off, moving silently through the D.C. streets toward the address Clara had given him, a rundown apartment building in Adams Morgan that he had never seen. When he walked into her small, sparsely furnished apartment, the sight that greeted him would be seared into his memory forever. Clara was sitting on her bed, her back to him. The waiter's uniform was shredded, her skin a horrific tapestry of red and purple welts. She was trembling, trying to apply antiseptic to a welt she couldn't reach. She hadn't heard him come in. He stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. All the power, all the influence, all the carefully constructed control he wielded on the world stage meant nothing. He had failed to protect his own child from a brute in a restaurant. The guilt was a physical blow. "Clara," he said softly. She flinched, turning around. Her face was tear-streaked and pale. Seeing him there, in his perfect suit, a symbol of the world she had run from, a fresh wave of shame washed over her. "I didn't want to call you," she whispered. "I can handle it." He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt before her, carefully taking the antiseptic wipe from her trembling fingers. He didn't speak. He gently cleaned the wounds, his touch surprisingly steady. He had tended to her scraped knees when she was a child, but this was a different universe of pain. "I have a doctor on the way," he said, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "He's discreet. He used to work for the agency." He looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. "Tell me everything, every detail. Do not leave anything out." As she recounted the story again, this time with the horrifying visual evidence before him, he felt his rage crystallizing from a hot, chaotic emotion into something cold, hard, and precise, like a diamond. When she finished, he stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. His city. "Alistair Finch," he said, the name tasting like poison. "I know him. He's been trying to get a contract with the department for his new logistics software. He thinks money and fear are the only 2 currencies in the world." He turned back to her. "You were right not to go to the police. Not yet. A man like Finch would bury this in legal motions. He'd paint you as a clumsy gold digger. The media would have a field day. Secretary's estranged daughter in restaurant scuffle. We are not going to fight him on his terms. We are going to fight him on ours." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her voice small. A flicker of the formidable Secretary of State returned to his eyes. "Men like Alistair Finch build their worlds on a foundation of reputation. They project an image of infallibility, of taste, of power. We are not just going to seek justice for what he did to you. We are going to take a hammer to that foundation. We are going to dismantle his world so completely that by the time we are done, no one will even remember his name." Just then, her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown number. "We know who your father is. Keep your mouth shut if you know what's good for him. People in his position are so very fragile." Clara showed the screen to her father. Vance read the message, and for the first time that night, a slow, cold smile touched his lips. "Good," he said softly. "He's arrogant. He thinks he's in control. He just made his first mistake." He looked at Clara, his daughter, no longer a child but a survivor. "And he has no idea that you are about to become his last." In the days that followed, Clara's apartment became a quiet command center. The discreet doctor came and went, treating her injuries and prescribing medication for the pain that was more than skin deep. The welts slowly faded from livid red to a mottled purple-green, but the psychological wounds remained raw. Sleep offered little escape, haunted by the crack of the whip and the smell of expensive scotch. Thomas Vance moved with a speed and precision that was terrifying to behold. He canceled all non-essential meetings, delegating duties to his undersecretaries. His focus was singular. Evelyn Reed, his loyal chief of staff, became his general. "Finch's entire public identity is built on 2 pillars," Vance explained: pacing Clara's small living room, which now felt charged with geopolitical tension. His business acumen and his status as a connoisseur of priceless antiquities. The assault charge is our moral high ground, but it's a he said, she said that he can tie up in court for years. The real vulnerability lies in his pride. He turned to Clara, who was curled up in an armchair, a blanket around her shoulders. That eagle, Clara. You said something felt wrong about it. Tell me again. Clara sat up, a spark of her old academic self returning. The patina was too even. Chemical aging creates a uniform finish. Natural aging, over 2,000 years in the ground, is always modeled inconsistent. And the talons, the musculature was carved with a level of anatomical precision that reflects a post-Renaissance understanding of biology. Roman artists were brilliant, but they didn't carve like that. Vance looked at Evelyn. Find me the world's leading expert on Roman bronzes, someone with an impeccable reputation, preferably someone who loathes men like Finch. Evelyn was already typing on her encrypted tablet. Dr. Aris Thorne, Oxford. He literally wrote the book on identifying forgeries, and he famously called private collectors who hoard unprovenanced artifacts glorified grave robbers. He's our man. Get him on a plane, Vance ordered, discreetly. Use the cultural exchange budget. While Evelyn made the arrangements, Vance focused on Finch's business. He didn't use the blunt instrument of government power. That would be too obvious, too traceable. Instead, he made two quiet phone calls. The first was to an old friend from his days in the private sector, now the head of a powerful sovereign wealth fund. The second was to the finance minister of a key European ally. He didn't mention Finch by name. He simply spoke of newfound market volatility and unforeseen risks in the tech logistics sector, advising a cautious approach to any new investments. He was planting seeds of doubt, leveraging the immense trust his word carried in those circles. Meanwhile, Finch was feeling untouchable. He had his fixer, a ruthless ex-intelligence operative named Marcus, handle the fallout. Julian, the manager of Aurelia, was paid a substantial sum for his silence and an NDA that carried ruinous penalties. The other guests at the dinner received polite but firm reminders of their mutually beneficial business relationships with Finch. The incident, as far as Finch was concerned, was buried. The threatening text to Clara was just insurance. His confidence was so absolute that he scheduled a press conference. He was donating the Eagle of the Lost Ninth to the National Museum of American History for a special exhibition. It was a masterstroke of public relations, cementing his status as a philanthropist and cultural benefactor, while simultaneously getting the artifact authenticated by a premier institution, which would only increase its value. When news of the planned donation reached them, Vance and Clara were with Evelyn in the apartment. He's walking right into it, Evelyn said, a hint of admiration in her voice. The sheer arrogance. Arrogance is a fatal flaw, Vance said calmly. He's handing us the stage, the audience, and the weapon. Dr. Aris Thorne arrived 2 days later, a sharp, cantankerous man in his 70s with eyes that had seen through centuries of lies. He met them in a secure room at the State Department. Clara, looking nervous but resolute, presented the 2 photos she had taken on her phone. Thorne adjusted his spectacles and looked at the images on a large, high-resolution monitor. He was silent for a full 5 minutes, zooming in on minuscule details. Finally, he leaned back. Ingenious work, he muttered, almost to himself. The forger is a true artist. He's mimicked the casting techniques of the Gallo-Roman workshops almost perfectly. Clara's heart sank. So it's real? Good heavens, no, child, Thorne scoffed. It's a magnificent fake. But your instincts were spot on. He pointed to the screen. You see that? Right there, on the eagle's left talon. It's a maker's mark, almost entirely eroded. But it's not Roman. It's the mark of Luigi Scarpelli, a brilliant and notorious Italian forger who operated out of Florence in the 1920s. He specialized in fooling wealthy American industrialists. It seems one of his masterpieces has resurfaced. A slow smile spread across Vance's face. Dr. Thorne, would you be willing to share your expert opinion publicly? Thorne's eyes glinted. Mr. Secretary, exposing a fraud like this and publicly humiliating a Philistine like Alistair Finch? It would be the highlight of my professional career. The plan was set. The trap was baited. The stage for Finch's downfall would be the very one he had built to celebrate his triumph. On the morning of the museum ceremony, Clara stood before her closet. She pushed aside the simple clothes of her student life and pulled out a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was a simple, elegant sheath of cobalt blue, her mother's favorite color. It was a dress that spoke of quiet confidence, of a world she had left behind, but whose strength she could still draw upon. When her father saw her, he stopped, his expression softening. "You look like your mother," he said, his voice quiet. "I feel like her today," Clara replied, meeting his gaze. "Ready for a fight." As they rode to the museum, a different kind of silence settled between them. Not one of distance, but of shared purpose. The father had seen his daughter not as a victim to be saved, but as a warrior in her own right, whose specialized knowledge was the key to their victory. The air in the museum atrium was a fragile crystal, built from the murmur of cultured voices, the scent of expensive perfume, and the clinking of champagne flutes against one another. It was an atmosphere Clara knew intimately, a world she had spent 2 years trying to escape. Tonight she had walked back into its heart, not as a rebel or a runaway, but as a ghost come to haunt the feast. She stood beside her father, a silent island in the stream of Washington's elite. He was a pillar of quiet strength, his presence a gravitational force that subtly bent the room around them, yet his focus was entirely on her. He had not touched her, had not offered a steadying hand, and she was grateful for it. This was her battleground, and he was giving her the dignity of facing it on her own terms. Across the room, Alistair Finch was a sun king at his own coronation, bathed in the warm glow of spotlights and adulation. When his eyes found hers, a flicker of something primal and ugly crossed his face, not shock, but a kind of possessive contempt. The sneer that followed was a silent articulation of his entire worldview. "You are still the girl on the floor. You are nothing." He believed her presence was a final, pathetic act of defiance, a gnat buzzing at the lion before the kill. He mistook her silence for fear. He had no way of knowing it was the profound calm that precedes a tectonic shift, the stillness of a perfectly set trap. His speech was a monument to his own ego, sculpted from phrases of civic duty and philanthropic grace. He spoke of legacy, of history, of the enduring power of symbols. He gestured to the bronze eagle, magnificent under the lights, and in that moment, Clara felt a strange, cold pang. It was a beautiful object. The lie it represented was a work of art in itself. Finch's gaze swept the room and landed on her and her father one last time, a smirk touching his lips. It was the look of a victor, so certain of his reality that he couldn't see the foundations turning to sand beneath his feet. Then the museum director, a man whose career was about to be irrevocably altered, stepped to the podium and introduced the evening's guest of honor. To officially receive and validate this extraordinary gift to the nation, we are privileged to have with us the world's preeminent authority on Roman bronzes from the University of Oxford, Dr. Eris Thorne. Dr. Thorne emerged from the wing with the deliberate, unhurried gait of a man who has outlasted empires. He was a hawk in tweed, his eyes sharp and accustomed to peering through the dust of centuries to find the truth. He approached the eagle not with reverence, but with the dispassionate curiosity of a pathologist examining a body. "A truly remarkable specimen," he began, his voice a dry, crisp instrument that commanded immediate silence. The British accent was a cloak of unimpeachable authority. "The artist's hand is bold, the casting ambitious. Mr. Finch is to be commended for his discerning eye, for recognizing an object of such potent narrative." Finch's chest swelled. The praise from the master was the final seal on his triumph. He was not just rich, he was a man of taste, a custodian of history. Dr. Thorne continued his slow circle of the statue. "History, however, is a text that is constantly being revised, often by the discovery of secrets hidden in plain sight." He produced a small, high-intensity laser pointer. A tiny blood-red dot appeared on the eagle's gleaming bronze flank. "If you would direct your attention to the screen, please." Behind him, a massive screen flickered to life, showing a highly magnified image of the eagle's talons. "Observe the musculature," Thorne instructed, his voice as sharp as a scalpel. The delineation of the flexor tendons, the precise curvature of the talons, it is exquisite. It is also, anatomically speaking, a product of the High Renaissance. It owes more to the studies of Vesalius and Da Vinci than to a first-century Roman fabrica, a beautiful anachronism. A low murmur, the sound of nascent confusion, rippled through the audience. Finch's smile became a rigid line. He was a statue himself now, a study in forced composure. An interesting stylistic choice, perhaps, Thorne mused, but hardly conclusive. Metallurgy, however, is less given to artistic license. The image on the screen changed to a complex spectrographic analysis. Our labs conducted a non-invasive analysis this morning. The bronze alloy contains distinct trace elements of zinc and, most tellingly, manganese. The Romans, masters of bronze though they were, did not use manganese as a hardening agent. It was, however, a signature component in the alloys favored by a certain Florentine artisan in the early 20th century, a man who specialized in creating masterpieces for a new and eager class of American industrialists. The murmur grew louder, laced now with the thrilling scent of scandal. Finch's pallor was ghastly under the spotlights. "This is preposterous," he managed, his voice a strained whisper that barely carried past the first row. "The provenance papers are ironclad." "Ah, the provenance?" Dr. Thorne said, turning to face Finch for the first time. The look in the old historian's eyes was not one of academic debate, but of utter predatory contempt. A fascinating work of fiction, a compelling story to accompany a compelling object. But the true provenance, the artist's real signature, is far more subtle. The image on the screen zoomed in again, focusing on a nearly microscopic point on the underside of a single talon, a place where shadow and verdigris had almost entirely obscured it. The laser dot circled a faint, swirling mark. For those of you unfamiliar with the esoteric world of historical forgeries, Dr. Thorne announced, his voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel, allow me to introduce you to the maker's mark of Luigi Scarpelli, the greatest forger of his generation. This, Mr. Finch, is not the eagle of the Ninth Legion. It is a brilliant, breathtaking, and monetarily worthless fake. The crystal atmosphere of the atrium did not just crack, it exploded. A collective, audible gasp was followed by the roar of camera shutters firing like machine guns. The flashes were strobing, merciless, capturing the disintegration of Alistair Finch in real time. He stood paralyzed, his face a canvas of disbelief, his mind frantically trying to reconcile the narrative of his omnipotence with the brutal reality of his humiliation. He was a connoisseur unmasked as a fool, a philanthropist revealed as a purveyor of lies. But Thomas Vance's plan was a cascade, and this was only the first, loudest rockfall. As Finch swayed on his feet, two men in impeccably tailored dark suits materialized from a side entrance. They moved with an unnatural calm through the burgeoning chaos, their presence instantly changing the temperature on the stage from social disaster to federal crime. "Alistair Finch?" the lead agent said, his voice devoid of emotion, cutting through the noise. He held up a leather billfold, flashing a badge. "Agent Davies, FBI Art Crime Team. We have a warrant for your arrest." Finch stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. "Arrest?" he finally choked out. "You can't arrest me for owning a fake. It's not a crime to be swindled." "No, sir, it is not," Agent Davies agreed with chilling politeness. "But financing the criminal syndicate that created and trafficked that fake is a federal offense. We've been tracking the Scarpelli Revival Syndicate for 18 months. Your series of wire transfers from an unregistered account in the Cayman Islands to one of their front corporations in Geneva was the final piece of the puzzle we needed. It appears your ironclad provenance was paid for with laundered money. You weren't just the victim of this fraud, Mr. Finch. You were an investor. It was the killing blow. Not just a fool, but a criminal. His carefully constructed identity, the titan of industry, the cultural benefactor, was not merely tarnished, it was vaporized. The foundation of his world was gone, and he was in freefall. His wild, terrified eyes scanned the chaotic room, searching for an anchor, and they locked on Clara. In that instant, the entire chain of events clicked into place in his collapsing mind. the spilled sauce, the ruined documents forcing him to use digital copies that were more easily scrutinized, the public donation that brought the object into the unforgiving light of expert analysis, the girl, the waitress. It had all been a trap, engineered with a patience and precision he could never have conceived of. His face contorted, rage and disbelief warring for supremacy. A strangled sound tore from his throat as he lunged forward, a final, reflexive act of violence. But the agents were faster, catching his arms and pinning them behind his back with brutal efficiency. He strained against them, his eyes still fixed on Clara. He wanted to scream at her, to curse her, to diminish her with one last volley of his fury. But Clara did not give him the satisfaction of triumph. She did not smile. Her expression was one of quiet, sorrowful finality. It was not pity for his plight, but for the profound emptiness of his soul. He had built an empire of things, of assets and acquisitions, and had never understood that a person's worth could not be tallied on a balance sheet. Her gaze told him that he had not been defeated by a Secretary of State's power, but by the quiet knowledge of a student of history. An intellect he had deemed so worthless he hadn't even noticed it was there. That look was the final, deepest cut. It was a lash not against her skin, but against the core of his being. The fight drained out of him. His body went limp, a puppet with its strings cut, as the agents led him away, a supernova of flashbulbs illuminating his path to oblivion. Thomas Vance's hand finally came to rest on his daughter's shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. He guided her through a private door, away from the ravenous clamor. They stepped into the cool, quiet embrace of the evening. The sirens in the distance were a fading, irrelevant chorus. Clara breathed. For the first time in weeks, it felt as though her lungs could fully expand. The immense, crushing weight of humiliation and fear, a phantom she had carried since that night at Aurelia, was gone, dissolved. Her father looked down at her, and in his eyes she saw an ocean of pride, fierce and deep. "He measured your value in dollars per hour," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "He built his world on the idea that everything and everyone has a price." Clara looked up at the darkening sky, the first stars emerging like diamond dust. A small, true smile touched her lips. "He saw a clumsy waitress," she said softly. "He should have seen a Roman historian." In the months that followed, the silence that fell after Finch's spectacular implosion was more damning than the noise had been. His name became a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms, a punchline in late-night monologues. The controlled demolition orchestrated by Thomas Vance was absolute. The seeds of doubt he had sown in financial markets bloomed into a contagion of distrust, and Finch's corporate empire, leveraged to the hilt and built on the flimsy scaffolding of his reputation, collapsed under its own weight. The assault trial was a perfunctory, quiet affair. Finch, stripped of his wealth and influence, sat shrunken in the defendant's chair. His high-priced lawyers had been replaced by a weary public defender. Julian, the manager from Aurelia, testified, his voice trembling but clear. He had been given a new identity and a subsidized restaurant of his own in another state, a quiet gift from a grateful father. Facing a mountain of evidence and a jury that had already convicted him in the court of public opinion, Finch was found guilty. The judge's sentence was a footnote to a story already written. But for Clara, justice was not a verdict. It was a process, internal and painstaking. Healing was not a straight line. It was a spiral staircase she sometimes had to descend to climb again. There were nights she woke up, the ghost of leather on her skin, her heart hammering against her ribs. An unexpected sharp sound, the crack of a branch underfoot in a park, could send a jolt of ice through her veins. She learned to sit with the fear, to acknowledge it as an echo, not a present danger. The scars on her back faded from angry welts to a lattice of faint, silvery lines. In the privacy of her apartment, she would sometimes trace them in the mirror, not with shame, but with a kind of detached wonder. They were no longer a brand of her humiliation. They were a part of her topography now, a map of where she had been. They were a testament, written on her own skin, that she had survived. Her relationship with her father was remade, reforged in the fire they had walked through together. The stilted phone calls and formal distance were gone, replaced by an easy intimacy. They met for dinner every Tuesday at a small, unassuming Italian place where no one knew who they were. They talked not of geopolitics, but of books and art and the quiet, ordinary passages of life. One evening over plates of pasta, he confessed something to her. That night after I left your apartment, I sat in my office until dawn. I had just used the trust and influence I've spent a lifetime building, the power of my office, for a singular, personal act of vengeance. He looked at her, his eyes unblinking, and I felt no remorse. None. I would burn the world down for you, Clara. I don't know if that makes me a good father, but it's the only truth I have left. Clara reached across the table and placed her hand on his. You didn't burn the world down, Dad, she said softly. You just exposed a part of it that was already rotten. You used your power to give a voice to someone who didn't have one. She squeezed his hand. You used it to give me back mine. A year to the day after the ceremony at the museum, Clara stood at a podium of her own at Georgetown University, delivering a guest lecture. The room was packed, students filling every seat and lining the back walls. The lecture was titled The Scarpelli Eagle, Provenance, Pathology, and the Psychology of the High-End Forgery. She was not the tentative girl who served men like Finch. She was a woman who owned the space she occupied, her voice clear, confident, and infused with the passion of her subject. She moved through the technical details of metallurgical analysis and stylistic anachronisms with the grace of a master. She spoke of how a forger's greatest tool is not his skill with bronze, but his understanding of a collector's vanity. In the back of the room, Thomas Vance stood, hidden in the shadows. He was not the Secretary of State. He was just a father, watching his daughter hold an audience captive. He saw not a victim who had healed, but a warrior who had taken the very weapon used against her and reforged it into a tool of enlightenment. As she concluded, bringing the image of the Scarpelli eagle back onto the screen, Clara paused. In the end, she told the silent room, this object's story is not about what is fake, but about what is real. It teaches us that value is a narrative we choose to believe. Some will always choose to believe in the story of power, of possession, of dominance. She looked out at the faces of the students, her gaze direct and unwavering. But true value, the kind that endures, is quieter. It is found in knowledge, in resilience, and in the unshakable belief that a person's worth is not defined by those who would seek to break them, but by the strength with which they rise. After the thunderous applause as students rushed the stage, Clara saw a new text message on her phone. It was from her father. You were magnificent. Your mother would have been so proud. She smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with peace. She walked out of the lecture hall and into the crisp autumn sunlight. The world felt new, a place of possibility. The scars on her back were silent, no longer a memory of pain, but a quiet, foundational strength. She was not defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by what she had chosen to become. She was Clara Vance, and she was finally irrevocably free.